He grabbed her arm, twisted it behind her back, and walked her through his own precinct in handcuffs, while his colleagues laughed. He told her she looked exactly like she belonged on the floor. He called her sweetheart. He announced her claimed title to the bullpen like it was the punchline to a joke he'd been telling his whole career. And when she warned him, when she told him calmly and precisely that he was making a mistake he would not be able to undo, he laughed harder. Officer Brett Mallory had spent 22 years doing this kind of thing. He had never in 22 years done it to the wrong person. Until today. Stay with this one, because what happens in the next hour doesn't just end one man's career. It dismantles an entire criminal operation that has been running inside a Seattle police precinct for 14 years. And the woman he put in handcuffs had been building the case to take it down for 4 months before she ever walked through his door. The flight from Washington, D.C. to Seattle-Tacoma International Airport takes 5 hours and 40 minutes when the winds cooperate. On this particular Tuesday morning, the winds did not cooperate. The middle seat had been occupied by a man who treated personal space as a philosophical suggestion, and United Airlines had managed to route Simone Carter's checked luggage to Phoenix, Arizona, where it would spend the next 2 days before anyone thought to look for it. She discovered this at 5:47 a.m. at the baggage carousel. She watched the belt cycle through the same collection of suitcases that were not hers. With the patience of a woman who had spent 20 years practicing restraint in rooms where restraint was not the easiest option. She assessed. She accepted. She moved. She had her carry-on. She had her leather document bag. She had the folder she had read cover to cover somewhere over Idaho. She had her credentials. She did not have a change of clothes, which meant that the United States Attorney for the Western District of Washington was going to walk into Precinct 9 in the same outfit she had worn on the red-eye, dark green, oversized hoodie, black leggings, and the worn New Balance running shoes she kept specifically for long travel days. She pulled the hood up against the Seattle rain, not the dramatic cinematic kind, but the patient, relentless soaking kind that finds the gap between your collar and your neck and stays there, and she walked to the Uber lane. 44 years old. Harvard Law, graduated top of her class. 3 years in Chicago's federal prosecutor office, dismantling organized crime networks where the defense bar had given her the nickname they used when they thought she wasn't listening, the closer. 7 years in private practice in DC-4 as a partner. Appointed 2 years ago to lead the Western District. She had taken down 2 cartel distribution networks, 1 corrupt city comptroller, and a commercial real estate developer who had been laundering money through dry cleaning businesses for 11 years. None of that was visible at 5:52 a.m. in a green hoodie with rain on her face, waiting for a gray Toyota Camry with a pine tree air freshener. She was invisible. That was precisely the point. The reason she had come early, 40 minutes before her scheduled 7 a.m. meeting with Captain Frank Dillon, was built on 4 months of work. Her office had received the first complaint about Precinct 9's narcotics unit from a community advocacy group in the Rainier Valley 8 months prior. A documented pattern of arrests that didn't hold up under scrutiny, conviction rates that suggested something other than good police work. A parade of defendants who had pled out because fighting the evidence cost more than accepting the sentence. She had assigned 2 investigators initially, then 4. Then she had called in FBI Special Agent Marcus Reed and his Public Corruption Task Force, and what they had assembled over the following months was not a complaint, it was a case. The warrants had been signed at 11 p.m. the night before. Reed's team had been staging inside Precinct 9's second-floor conference room since 5 a.m., brought in through a side entrance under the cover of a routine coordination meeting. The evidence boxes were already stacked. The timelines were already on the boards. One name appeared on those boards 17 times. Officer Brett Mallory. Simone had come early and alone because she wanted to see the precinct the way it breathed when no one important was watching. She wanted its character unperformed. She wanted to understand the man she was about to dismantle before she dismantled him. She had not planned to spend 40 minutes in handcuffs, but she had somewhere in the back of her mind, in the place where 20 years of experience lived, alongside 20 years of being a black woman in spaces that questioned her right to be there, considered that it was possible. The Camry pulled up. She got in. They drove toward Precinct 9 through rain that showed no sign of stopping, And Simone Carter opened her document bag and pulled out a file and read it in the gray morning light, adding one more thing to the column of things she intended to remember. A name buried in a plea deal from 3 years ago. Marcus Webb, 24 years old, a university student who had pled guilty to possession with intent to distribute because fighting it would have cost him 2 years he didn't have. The public defender's notes read, "Client maintains innocence. Evidence appears clean. Advise plea." Something about that file sat wrong in a way she could not yet fully name. She folded the corner of the page and put it back. She would return to Marcus Webb. The front desk was unmanned. Not temporarily unmanned in the deliberate way of a habit. The chair pushed all the way back a granola bar wrapper. On the desk surface, the computer dark. A sign on the glass read, "For after-hours emergencies, use the intercom." The intercom was 12 feet to the left. Nobody explained that to the people walking in. Simone filed this in the column she was building. The side security gate was propped open with a red fire extinguisher wedged at a careful angle to prevent it swinging back. Someone had done this deliberately as a convenience so many times that it had become invisible, the kind of security failure that only registers when you are looking for it. Simone walked through without touching the extinguisher. The corridor's bulletin board had a domestic violence resource flyer with a phone number that had been updated 14 months ago. The old number was still printed here. A community meeting announcement from 8 months prior. A shift schedule amended so many times in a ballpoint pen that the original printing was archaeological. Nobody had looked at this board with fresh eyes in close to a year. She found Captain Dillon's office at the end of the east corridor, door ajar, lights off morning gray, filtering through the angled blinds. She stepped inside, set her bag on the chair nearest the door, and moved to the bookshelf that covered the right wall. Commendations framed at precise angles. A group photo of a precinct softball team circa 2009. A memorial plaque for an officer who had died in 2015 doing the job with his whole self. She pulled the internal affairs complaint log from her document bag and opened it on the captain's desk. 47 complaints in 3 years against Precinct 9's narcotics unit. 43 of them marked investigated and unsubstantiated in language so identical across entries that it was clear the investigation was the same investigation performed once and stamped 43 times. She was cross-referencing complaint dates against arrest records when she heard the voice behind her. "Make yourself at home." "Why don't you?" Not a question. A growl, the sound of a man asserting territory before he had assessed a single fact which told her everything she needed to know before she turned around. She turned around slowly, keeping her hands visible, her face neutral. Officer Brett Mallory filled the doorway, the way certain men fill doorways, not because of height alone, but because of the specific intention with which he occupied space. He was 52, 6 feet 2 heavy across the chest and gut in a way that strained his uniform at the 3rd and 4th buttons. His face was a map of broken capillaries and 22 years of unexamined choices, the nose, the cheeks, the jaw that suggested elevated blood pressure, or too many evenings at a bar that didn't ask much of its customers. His name tag was pinned crooked. His boots were scuffed at the toe in the way of a man who had stopped bothering with details some years ago. He was holding a styrofoam cup of coffee. His other hand rested near his hip. He looked at Simone. His eyes moved from her face to her natural hair, pulled back simply and still slightly damp from the rain, to her hoodie, to her leggings, to her running shoes, to the document bag on the chair, to the complaint log open on his captain's desk. He processed all of it in 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, something in his expression moved from reflexive hostility to the specific, comfortable satisfaction of a man whose first impression has been confirmed by the evidence. He had decided what she was before he finished looking. "Good morning, Officer," Simone said, calm, professional, the voice she used in federal court when being measured. "I'm waiting for Captain Dillon. I have an appointment at 7. Mallory stepped into the room. He did not walk. He encroached, using his size as an instrument, compressing the available space until the room felt smaller than it was. He took a long sip of coffee without breaking eye contact. The gesture of a man who owned the clock in every room he entered. "Captain's not in," he said. "He doesn't take meetings with civilians before 8, especially not ones who wander in off the street." I have an appointment, Simone said again, the same register. Sure you do. He laughed, dry, humorless, the laugh of a man who found the claim not improbable, but irrelevant. Just like the guy in holding has an appointment with the governor. He tilted his head, performing consideration. Let me guess. Parking ticket. Or maybe your boyfriend got picked up last night, and you're here to tell me he's a good person who doesn't deserve this. Simone felt the heat that ignited in her chest when people spoke to her this way. Not a flash of temper, but a slow, cold burn, the kind that had won her trials in Chicago, when opposing counsel was arrogant and left witnesses exposed. She pressed it down. She wanted the full picture. I'm here for a federal review, she said. If you could notify the captain when he arrives, I'd appreciate it. Federal review. He set his coffee on the edge of the desk and stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the stale tobacco and the spearmint gum laid over it. He pointed a thick finger at her chest, not touching, but deliberate. You expect me to believe you're a Fed. I expect you to allow me to present my credentials, she said. Get out. Excuse me, I said, he enunciated slowly with the exaggerated patience of a man explaining something to someone he considered incapable of keeping up. Get out. You're trespassing. I don't know how you got past the desk, but you are leaving this building right now. Simone did not move. She was 5 feet 7 inches tall, and she stood with the posture of someone who had earned the right to be in this room and every other room she had ever entered, and the posture required no additional height to be completely convincing. Officer, she said, my name is Simone Carter. I am the United States Attorney for the Western District of Washington. My credentials are in the side pocket of my bag. I am asking you to stand down and allow me to retrieve them. 4 seconds of silence. Then Mallory threw his head back and laughed. Full loud, carrying the laugh of a man sharing a joke with the walls. U.S. Attorney, he announced to the empty room. Did you hear that? He turned toward the doorway. Webb, get in here. Come listen to this. Officer Dylan Webb appeared in 20 seconds, 26 years old, 2 years out of the academy, still carrying the coffee he'd just poured. He had the build of someone who had played college baseball and kept it up, and the expression of someone who was not yet sure whether the discomfort he felt on a daily basis in this precinct was normal or something he should be alarmed by. He was, in Simone's assessment, a man standing at the last possible moment before a choice became permanent. He looked from Mallory to Simone, taking in the document bag, the open file, the very straight posture of the woman standing calmly by the captain's desk. What's going on, Brett? This woman, Mallory said with the loose contempt of someone pointing at something that had fallen off a shelf, claims she's the U.S. Attorney. Says she has an appointment. I caught her going through the captain's files. Webb's eyes moved to Simone's face. Something in his expression, some young instinct not yet fully extinguished, registered uncertainty. Ma'am, he said carefully, do you have ID? My credentials are in the side pocket of my bag, Simone said, nodding to the chair. I can retrieve them now. She moved her hand toward the bag. Hands. Mallory's voice had stripped itself of the mockery and become something harder and faster. The voice of a man who had spent 22 years conditioning people to freeze when he used this register. His right hand dropped to his holster, not to the weapon, to the retention strap, a position, a message. Simone's hand stopped. She was still, every part of her absolutely still, the stillness of someone who has practiced not reacting to the thing that most demands a reaction, because the reaction is what they want. Officer Mallory, she said, his name chosen deliberately, maintaining the register of professional respect. Even now, my credentials are in that bag. I am reaching for a wallet containing a federal badge and identification issued by the Department of Justice. I am not a threat. I am not armed. I am asking you one final time to allow me to verify my identity before this situation becomes something neither of us can walk back. I don't care what you say is in there, Mallory said. He stepped toward her. You are acting suspicious. You are trespassing. Back away from the bag. Hands on top of your head. Turn around. Officer Mallory. Her voice went to the register she reserved for closing arguments, the voice that filled federal courtrooms and made juries stop moving. You are making a career-ending mistake. I am telling you that directly, clearly, and with full knowledge of what I am saying. Call your watch commander. Let me retrieve my identification. Do it right now. He looked at her, He looked at the calm in her eyes, which was not the calm of someone without options. It was the calm of someone with more options than he could count. He saw something in her face that he could not name, that his 22 years of certainty could not accommodate, and his response to it was the response that certainty always has when it encounters something it cannot categorize. He doubled down. "The only mistake I made," he said quietly, "was not cuffing you the second I saw you in this hallway." He unclipped his radio. "Dispatch Mallory Unit 9. Send a female officer to the captain's second-floor office. Trespassing suspect. Possible impersonation of a federal officer. Need a paytown before transport to holding." He clipped the radio back and looked at Simone with an expression she recognized from the complaint logs. The look of a man for whom this was not an exceptional moment. The look of a man doing something he had done so many times it had stopped requiring justification. "Turn around," he said. Simone Renee Carter turned around. She laced her fingers behind her head, the way she had been instructed to do when she was 19 years old, in a different city, by a different officer who had spoken to her in a register. That was, she now understood the same register. She had not forgotten the posture. She had hoped in the years since that she would not need to remember it. Her heart was moving faster than she wanted it to. Not from fear, she had sat across interrogation tables from cartel accountants who ordered deaths the way other men ordered coffee, and she had not been afraid. What was moving through her now was older and more complicated. It was the compound-specific fury of a woman who had spent her entire adult life clearing every bar, earning every credential, justifying her presence in every room that questioned it, standing face first toward a beige wall. Because a man with a crooked name tag had decided in 3 seconds what she was. She stared at the wall. Behind her, she heard the clink of handcuffs being unclipped from his belt. She heard Webb make a sound, not a word, something involuntary, brief, the sound a person makes when they know something is wrong and are not going to say so. Derek Webb said, his voice lower now. "The captain will be here any minute. If there's even a chance, she's T." Webb. Mallory said it the way he always said it, without heat, without interest. The dismissal of a man who had been overriding Webb's instincts for 2 years and found the override effortless. "This is exactly why you're still walking a beat. No instincts. 22 years. I know a criminal when I see one. She has guilty written all over her." He grabbed her left wrist and twisted it behind her back with a force that went past restraint into something that served no tactical purpose. The pain was sharp and specific, shooting up through her shoulder, and she breathed through it the way she had been trained to breathe through high-pressure moments, controlled, precise, not giving him the sound he was waiting for. "I am not resisting," she said. Her voice was even. "I am complying with your physical direction and formally stating for the record that this arrest is unlawful, that I have identified myself as a federal officer, and that this use of force is witnessed." "Save it," Mallory said. The second cuff closed. 2 notches past necessary, she felt the metal against the bone of her wrist, the bite of it that would deepen over the next hour into something that would require documentation. He grabbed her upper arm and walked her forward and pushed her with the studied impersonality of someone who had decided she was furniture, so that her chest came down against Captain Dillon's mahogany desk, her cheek against the polished wood, the complaint log sliding toward the edge. "There," Mallory said. He was slightly winded from the effort, and she could hear the satisfaction in the word, the specific satisfaction of a man who had reestablished the order of things. "Now you look like you belong." He keyed his radio. "Dispatch, cancel the female officer. Suspect is secured. Transporting to holding myself." From behind her, Webb moved once toward her, one step the step of a man who has made a decision and then stopped. She heard the specific silence of that decision reversing itself. She heard his footsteps go toward the door and keep going. Webb Mallory said, almost friendly now, "Get some coffee. I've got this." He hauled her upright by the upper arm with the efficiency of someone performing a familiar task. "Let's go. And if you trip, that's on you." He walked her out. The bullpen of Precinct 9 at 6:34 in the morning was coming to life in the slow institutional way of large buildings, finding their rhythm, fluorescent lights cycling on in sections, the coffee machine warming officers arriving in ones and twos. There were perhaps 12 people in the room when Mallory walked Simone through the door. 14 by the time they reached the center. Every one of them stopped. The picture was familiar to every person in this room. A senior officer walking a black woman in handcuffs through the operational center of the precinct at 6:30 on a Tuesday morning. They had seen this picture before. The difference between this morning and all those other mornings was invisible to everyone in the room except Simone. Mallory performed for the room. 22 years of muscle memory. Got a live one, he announced with the warmth of someone sharing good news. Caught her in the captain's office going through the files. Claims she's the U.S. attorney. He paused on the phrase, letting it marinate. Can you believe the nerve? The laughter was quick and came from at least 4 officers. Simone cataloged them without turning her head, using the partial reflection in the window at the far end of the room. A heavyset man at the left desk. 2 younger officers by the equipment lockers. A woman in her 40s who laughed once sharply, then looked down and found something urgent on her desk. U.S. attorney in a hoodie, said the heavyset man. That's a new one. And I'm the Chief Justice, said one of the younger officers, grinning. You lose your briefcase, counselor. More laughter. Simone moved her eyes from face to face, from name tag to name tag, from the ones who laughed to the ones who looked away to the ones who found their keyboards suddenly fascinating. She was building a list. Not metaphorically, she was encoding names and faces and the precise character of each response with the same efficiency she brought to reading case files, because this was in fact a case and these people were in fact witnesses to their own choices. As they neared the elevator at the far end of the bullpen, Mallory leaned close to her ear. His voice dropped to the register of a private conversation, which meant it was a performance for himself rather than the room. You know what gets me about people like you, he said. The confidence. Standing in my house, in my building, telling me you're something you're not. 22 years I've been doing this. 22 years, and not once has someone with a fake story and a hoodie been who they claim to be. He paused, and the pause had the weight of everything he was about to add. Nobody's coming for you. In this building, I am the law. I've been the law here since before you knew what law was. And you are going to sit in a holding cell and rethink whatever story brought you through that door. Simone said nothing. She was thinking about the warrant signed at 11 p.m. She was thinking about Marcus Reed, 2 floors above her, with 3 months of evidence in boxes that told the story of what Brett Mallory's 22 years had actually looked like. She was thinking about the name she had folded the corner of the page on Marcus Webb, 24, a university student who had said he didn't do it and been told to take the deal. She was thinking about the next 12 minutes. Mallory pressed the elevator button. The light came on. Above them, the car began its descent. He placed one hand on her shoulder, not gripping, just placing the casual possessiveness of ownership, and waited. The elevator chimed. The doors opened. They were already laughing. The sound came through the narrowing gap of the doors, the easy, morning bright laughter of people who had been working together long enough to have running jokes. Captain Frank Dillon's voice finishing a sentence. A second voice lower affirming something. The brief sound of a woman's pen clicking against her notepad. The doors opened fully. Captain Frank Dillon, 58, white-haired dress whites, pressed to a razor edge for a 6 a.m. meeting with the mayor's liaison office, stood in the center of the elevator mid-laugh. To his left was Marcus Reed, 44, FBI special agent in charge of Seattle's field office, in a dark gray suit that fit the way good suits fit men who take their work seriously. To Reed's right stood his assistant, Claire, stenographer's pad in hand. All 3 were mid-conversation. All 3 were in the tail end of a laugh. The laugh stopped. Dillon's eyes found Mallory, first familiar routine, a senior officer at the start of a shift. Then they moved the way eyes move when a frame doesn't resolve correctly, sliding across the full composition. The woman in handcuffs. The green hoodie. The posture, straight, deliberate, controlled, that was wrong for the situation in a way he couldn't immediately name. The face which was not the face of someone who had been frightened. It was the face of someone who had been watching. He looked at her face. Something moved in his expression. Not recognition, not yet. The leading edge of recognition. The place where recognition lives before it arrives. Reed was not going through that process. Reed had worked alongside Simone Carter for 4 months. He had been on a phone call with her at midnight, reviewing warrant language 2 nights ago. He knew her face the way a colleague knows a colleague's face completely, without processing, without any distance between seeing and knowing. What crossed Reed's face in the first half-second was not recognition. It was the stage past recognition, the stage of response. Miss Carter, Reed said. Quiet, controlled. He was a man who had spent his career at maximum pressure, requiring maximum restraint, and every gram of that training was in the 2 words which contained within them approximately 6 things he was not yet saying out loud. Simone turned toward him. She stood very straight. The cuffs, still 2 notches too tight, were behind her. The bruise forming along her left cheekbone from the desk was faint, the kind that would deepen through the morning into something that would require photographs at a physician's office. Good morning, Marcus, she said. She shifted her gaze to Dylan, and the shift was unhurried and complete. Good morning, Captain Dylan. I believe we had a 7 o'clock appointment. I apologize for the attire. My luggage was lost at SeaTac. She paused, and the pause held the weight of everything she was choosing not to say in this particular moment. Your officer decided that my wardrobe constituted probable cause for arrest. I thought you should hear that directly from me before the paperwork gets interesting. Mallory's smile lasted 3 seconds after the doors opened. It was the smile of a man awaiting confirmation, the captain arriving, seeing the situation, assessing it correctly, according to the established order of things, telling Mallory he'd handled it right. The smile was comfortable, habitual. It had lived on his face through 2 decades of mornings exactly like this one. Then it twitched. The twitch was small, a single involuntary contraction at the corner of his mouth. His eyes moved from Reed to Dylan. Reed was looking at the woman in handcuffs with an expression that did not belong in the framework Mallory had constructed. Dylan was looking at the woman in handcuffs with the expression of a man who has stepped off a curb that was not where he thought it was. Mallory, Dylan said, the controlled voice of a man keeping his register from doing something louder. What happened here? Not a question. Morning, Cap, Mallory said, and the smile was still running, still operating on momentum, the program not yet receiving the signal to stop. Found her in your office. Chai. Going through your files. She claimed she was a Fed. I secured her, and I'm taking her to holding trespassing impersonation. Textbook. He said it the way he always said it. Clipped and confident. The delivery of a man who had said this kind of thing 200 times and had never been told he'd gotten it wrong. The silence that followed was the kind that changes a room's temperature. Reed stepped out of the elevator. He moved past Mallory without acknowledging him, the deliberate non-acknowledgement of a man deciding what to do with something before he deals with it, and positioned himself slightly to Simone's left, establishing the geometry of the space with complete clarity. Miss Carter, he said quietly. Are you injured? The wrists will need documentation, she said. Otherwise functional. Reed looked at her wrists. The red welts where the cuffs bit into the bone were visible above the cuff edge. His jaw moved once and was still. Dylan stepped out of the elevator. His face had completed its journey. The confusion was gone. What remained was pale, rigid, deeply unhappy clarity. Officer Mallory, he said, and his voice was barely above a whisper, which was worse than shouting, would have been uncuff her. Right now. Mallory's mouth opened. She's the Hoodie he started. Uncuff her, Derek. Dylan's voice was shaking now, not from uncertainty. That is Simone Carter. She is the United States Attorney. She has been on my calendar for a week. The color left Mallory's face. It did not leave gradually, the way a fever breaks. It went the way a light goes out, present then not the transition too fast to track. The red-mapped landscape of his complexion, every broken capillary, every flush of blood pressure, and 22 years of unchecked certainty drained away. What remained was a gray slack surface that made him look for the first time his age plus 10 years. He looked at Simone Carter. He looked at her the way he had not looked at her before, not as a category to be processed and managed, but as a specific person. He saw the intelligence in her eyes. He saw the steel that had been there since the first moment in the office, and that he had interpreted as attitude rather than what it actually was. He saw the absolute settled composure of someone who had not been surprised by any of this, who had been watching all of it and adding to a column in her mind. He saw what he had done. His hand went to his belt. He found the cuff key. His fingers were not cooperative. They were doing the thing that fingers do when the adrenaline reverses and the body understands ahead of the mind that everything has changed and the change is not recoverable. He dropped the key. The small metallic sound of it hitting the linoleum floor was in the silence of that elevator corridor the loudest thing in the building. It rang clearly off the tile and skittered 2 inches and lay there reflecting the fluorescent light with an indifference that was almost offensive. Mallory bent to retrieve it. His movements were clumsy and disconnected the movements of a man whose body had stopped receiving coherent instructions. He straightened. He tried to insert the key into the lock of the left cuff. His hand was shaking badly enough that he missed the slot. He tried again. He missed again. He looked at the key in his shaking hand, and then at the cuffs he could not open, and then at the people watching him fail to open them, and something in his face, the last remnant of the man who had walked into that office an hour ago, knowing exactly what he was and what he was entitled to, simply caved. "Allow me," Reed said. He said it in the tone of a man solving a practical problem. He held out his hand. Mallory placed the key in it with the surrendering movement of someone who has exhausted their options and knows it. Reed unlocked the cuffs in 4 seconds. He removed them cleanly. Simone brought her arms forward slowly, the specific deliberateness of someone managing real pain in the wrists and shoulders. She turned her wrists over. The red welts were vivid against her dark skin, already purpling at the deepest points of pressure. In the jury box, when this footage would eventually be played at trial, 2 jurors would look away at this image. 1 would not. Reed looked at the marks. His jaw moved once and settled. Simone rubbed her wrists. She adjusted her hoodie. She smoothed her hair. She looked at Brett Mallory with the level, unhurried gaze of someone who has already moved to the next phase of a plan and is simply confirming that the current phase has concluded correctly. Mallory was shrinking. Not metaphorically, there was an actual physical quality to it, as if the structural certainty that had held him upright and imposing for 22 years had been extracted and the rest of him was settling around its absence. He was still 6 feet 2. He was no longer using any of it. Behind them, the bullpen was absolutely silent. Every officer who had laughed was standing very still, calculating. Simone did not go to a private office. She understood what a private office would mean. The officers in the bullpen, the ones who had laughed, the ones who had looked away, the ones who had made the specific choice not to intervene would return to their mornings with the comfortable ambiguity of bystanders who had not been officially confronted. She was not going to give them that ambiguity. She turned toward the bullpen. "I want everyone in this room to stay where they are," she said. The voice she used in federal court calibrated to carry without effort. "All of you." She walked to the center of the floor, the same floor she had been walked across in handcuffs 9 minutes ago, and she stood there with her hands at her sides and her posture, the posture of someone who had earned the right to occupy this specific space and intended to use it fully. "Officer Mallory," she said, "you told me in that office that you know a criminal when you see one. I want to examine that statement in front of everyone who heard you make the arrest." Mallory was near the elevator doors. He said nothing. "Is it standard protocol in this precinct?" Simone said, her voice the precise, measured delivery of someone reading an indictment to address a visitor as sweetheart. "Is it standard protocol to assume a federal credential is fraudulent based on the appearance of the person presenting it? Is it standard protocol to apply a level of physical force that results in documented bruising to a compliant individual who has made no threatening movement and has stated clearly multiple times that she is not resisting?" "It was a misunderstanding," Mallory said. His voice had the quality of something compressed, carefully managed, smaller than usual. "Standard protocol. She was in a restricted area without verifiable." "She walked through your propped open security gate," Dylan said from the elevator bank. He sounded like a man hearing his own voice from a distance. "I was protecting the precinct," Mallory said. "No," Simone said. She said it without volume, without heat, with the finality of a sentence being handed down. "You were protecting your ego. And you were doing what the complaint logs in your personnel file indicate you have done 17 times in the documented record of this precinct, using the authority of that badge to override the rights of people you decided, before speaking to them, did not deserve those rights." She walked to the nearest desk and picked up her document bag, which Webb had left there when Mallory had ordered him away. She reached inside and removed the federal indictment, thick folded in thirds, printed on Western District letterhead, carrying the magistrate judge's signature from 11 p.m. the night before. She held it up. For 4 months, she said, addressing the room, "My office, in coordination with the FBI's Public Corruption Task Force, has been conducting a covert federal investigation into the narcotics unit of this precinct." She let the current move through the room. "We have documented evidence of narcotics skimming from the evidence room. We have documented evidence of planted evidence used to secure false convictions. And we have documented evidence of a protection racket operated by senior officers of this precinct for personal financial gain over a period of more than 14 years. She opened the indictment. This document names specific officers to be taken into federal custody immediately. Officer Brett Mallory, you are named on the following counts: conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, and falsification of official law enforcement records. Mallory's knees did not buckle. They came close enough that he grabbed the nearest desk with one hand and steadied himself against it. And the steadying had the visible quality of someone who has decided that falling is not acceptable, even when standing has become difficult. Agent Reed, Simone said. With genuine pleasure, Reed said quietly. The handcuffs he produced were black steel federal issue. He walked toward Mallory with the unhurried efficiency of someone for whom this was in fact a Tuesday, and Mallory, 22 years senior officer mountain, in every doorway he had chosen to fill, took one step backward before he stopped himself. One step caught and corrected, because even now, even in this, the habit of not appearing weak in front of colleagues was stronger than the full reality of what was happening. It did not help him. Reed spun him around and cuffed him with clean, economical movements that were the precise opposite of everything Mallory had done in the captain's office. No twist, no extra notch, no force beyond what was necessary. Just the clean, cold authority of someone operating at the correct calibration. Brett Mallory, you are under arrest for federal racketeering and civil rights violations, Reed said. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. As Reed continued the advisement, Mallory looked out at the bullpen. He looked at the officers, the ones who had laughed at Simone's claimed title 12 minutes ago. The ones who had told the room they were the Chief Justice and the King of England. The ones who had found their desks very interesting during the walkthrough. He looked for something. The unspoken currency of the uniform. The belonging. The understood solidarity that had always been there when he needed it. He found none of it. He found officers who were studying their keyboards and their shoelaces and the middle distance with the focused determination of people engaged in the urgent private calculation of their own futures. Nobody met his eyes. Nobody stepped forward. Nobody said a word. The blue wall of silence had not been broken by scandal or violence. It had been dissolved without drama by a woman in a green hoodie who had spent 4 months preparing for this morning. This is a setup, Mallory said, his voice climbing as Reed began walking him toward the door. She came in here dressed like that on purpose. She wanted this to happen. This is entrapment. I was doing my job. Simone stepped into his path. She moved through the silent bullpen with the same unhurried pace she had used all morning, and she stopped in front of him, close enough that he could not look away from her face. I didn't dress like this to trap you, Mallory, she said. Quiet. Absolute. I dress like this because I'm a human being who got off a red-eye with lost luggage and came to work. That should have been enough for you to treat me with basic dignity. The fact that it wasn't the fact that you looked at me and saw something to be managed before I had spoken a single word, that's not something I did to you. She held his gaze for one more second. That's who you are, and it's why you're going to prison. She nodded to Reed. Reed walked Mallory to the door. The heavy door of Precinct 9 swung shut behind them, and the bullpen was left in a silence so complete and so new that it felt like the building itself had changed while they were standing in it. Simone turned back to the room. Her wrists ached. Her cheekbone would be purple by noon. She had not slept in 20 hours, and she was wearing a green hoodie and running shoes. And she was the most authoritative presence in the building. Captain Dillon, she said this precinct is under federal oversight. Effective this moment, I want every body camera archive from the past 3 years preserved and flagged. Every arrest report bearing Mallory's name isolated for examination. A full evidence room inventory by end of day. She looked at the officers, the frightened, the calculating, the carefully neutral. Agent Reed's team is on the 2nd floor. If you have information relevant to this investigation, go up today. If you participated in what we have documented, cooperation is your only viable option. She paused. She held up her wrists one final time, the bruising clear and vivid under the fluorescent light. And if you simply looked the other way because it was easier, I want you to think about what that decision costs. Not for my sake. She lowered her hands. For theirs. Nobody moved. Good, Simone Carter said. Now, Captain, do you have decent coffee? I've had a very long morning. Mallory was out on bail in 46 hours. His union lawyer, Conrad Hayes, had the silver hair and the 3-piece suits of a man who wore his track record the way other men wore watches, visibly expensively designed to remind everyone in the room that he had been here before and had prevailed. He got the bond set at $30,000, citing 22 years of service home ownership in the district and a 3-year-old granddaughter. A sympathetic state court judge set the number before the federal charges superseded. The union's legal fund covered it before lunch. By Thursday morning, Mallory was at home. By Thursday evening, the union was on television. Their communications director stood at a podium in front of the union building, brick facade flag in perfect condition, the visual vocabulary of institutional legitimacy, and delivered the press conference that Hayes had been drafting since the morning of the arrest. Decorated officer, exemplary record, deliberate provocation by a prosecutor with a documented political agenda. Entrapment. The word appeared 4 times. Activist prosecution appeared twice. The director did not address the indictment. He did not address the ledger. He did not acknowledge the boxes of evidence currently filling 300 square feet of Precinct 9's 2nd floor. What he did say in the final minute of his statement was something that Simone flagged immediately. Officer Mallory has served this community with distinction for over 2 decades. He made a judgment call based on what he saw. If we start criminalizing the judgment calls of officers who have dedicated their lives to keeping our streets safe, we will have no officers left. A judgment call based on what he saw. Simone watched the clip in her war room on the 6th floor of the federal building. She watched it twice. She wrote the phrase on the legal pad in front of her and drew a circle around it. He just handed us the centerpiece of the civil rights argument, she said to Reed, who was reading a file across the table. A judgment call based on what he saw. What he saw was a black woman in a hoodie. That's their defense. Make sure it's in the brief. Reed looked up. Already is. Mallory could not stay quiet. Hayes had told him to say nothing to anyone outside of their attorney-client conversations. Mallory's ego had been processing this instruction for 4 days and had concluded that staying quiet felt too much like losing, which was intolerable. By the following Monday, he was on a podcast called The Thin Blue Truth, hosted by a man who had opinions about policing proportional to his distance from it. Mallory was careful. Hayes had trained him to be careful. But careful for Mallory meant staying just inside the lines of what could be used against him, which meant he was still on the lines. The system is broken, Mallory said into the microphone, settling back with the authority of a man who had been saying versions of this sentence for 22 years. You've got people in positions of power now who got there not because of their record, but because of optics. And those people have an agenda, and the agenda isn't justice. You're talking about the prosecutor, the host said. I'm talking about a type, Mallory said carefully. A type that looks at guys like me, traditional guys who did the job the way the job was meant to be done, and sees a target, sees an opportunity. Reverse persecution, the host offered. I'm just saying, when I came up, the law was the law. You enforced it, or you didn't. Now it's all about how things look and who's watching and what narrative you're building. He paused. And the guys who actually kept this city safe, we're the ones paying for that. He said it with the ease of a man who had been rehearsing this version of himself for weeks and believed it completely. He did not know that Reed's team had flagged the recording within 40 minutes of it going live. He did not know that 3 specific sentences from the podcast, time-stamped, transcribed, cross-referenced against the arrest report he had filed the morning of Simone's detention, which contained 17 factual inaccuracies, would be entered as Exhibit 22 in United States versus Brett Mallory under the heading of consciousness of guilt. He was not building a defense. He was building his own exhibit list. Simone watched the clip at her desk that evening with a cup of coffee she had not touched. She set her phone face down. "Good," she said to the empty room. "More evidence." The break-in happened on a Tuesday night, 12 days after the arrest. Simone had been in the federal building until 10:40 p.m., reviewing the discovery timeline with her deputy and 2 of Reed's agents. She took a car service home, a concession to Reed's security protocols that she had accepted without discussion. The driver pulled up at 10:54. She went inside, nodded to the night doorman, took the elevator. Her apartment door was unlocked. She had locked it. She always locked it deadbolt and chain, a habit from Chicago years that had long since become automatic. She stood in the hallway with her document bag on her shoulder and her hand not touching the door, and she ran through the alternatives. The building had good security. The doorman had been at his desk. There was no reasonable version of this where she had forgotten. She pushed the door open with her fingertip and stood in the frame. The apartment had been searched by someone who wanted her to know it had been searched. Not burglarized. Her television was in place, her laptop on the kitchen counter, the jewelry in the bowl on the dresser, undisturbed. What had been done was deliberate, and surgical drawers, standing open, books, swept from shelves and left in piles on the floor. The filing cabinet's contents, stacked with a pointed lack of concealment. Someone had looked at everything. They had wanted her to know they could look at everything. On the kitchen counter, a steak knife had been driven into the wood. Pinned beneath the blade was a single sheet of paper folded once. "Drop the charges or we drop the files." She stood in her kitchen and looked at the knife in her counter, and she let herself feel completely and without management what the moment actually was. The fear which was real. The violation which was personal. The specific compound fury of a woman who had spent her career confronting men who believed that intimidation was a tool they were entitled to use against people who threatened their power. She gave herself 30 seconds. Then her phone buzzed. Unknown number. A photograph. Her younger brother, Devin Carter, 41 years old. 11 years clean. A family counselor at a recovery center in Spokane who did some of the most meaningful work she had ever watched anyone do. The photo was grainy and old. The haircut was from at least 3 years ago. Devin at a street corner. Devin talking to someone she didn't recognize. Devin's hands in his pockets, a gesture she recognized as his characteristic way of standing when he was listening to someone. The caption, "Shame the press doesn't know the U.S. Attorney's brother is a junkie." Hypocrite. Simone sat down on her kitchen floor. Not because her legs failed, she was aware of choosing this, the deliberate act of sitting, of being still for a controlled moment before she moved. She sat on the floor of her violated kitchen, and she looked at the photograph of her brother, who had fought the hardest private war she had ever witnessed up close, and she let the specific fury of having someone weaponize the most sacred and hard-won thing in her family's history burn through her cleanly, completely, without suppression. 30 seconds. She stood up and called Reed. "Marcus," she said when he answered. "They broke in. I'm at my apartment. I haven't touched anything." A pause. "They sent a photo of Devin. Old from years ago. They're framing it as current. They want me to drop the charges." Reed's silence lasted 2 seconds. When he spoke, his voice had the quality she associated with him at his most dangerous, very quiet, very even, all temperature removed. "They just committed a federal crime," he said. Title 18, Section 872. Blackmailing a federal officer. Mandatory minimum. They thought they were applying pressure. What they actually did was hand us an additional count and a traceable digital trail from a phone they used. He paused. "Can you call Devin before he sees the news coverage?" "That's exactly what I'm about to do," she said. "I'm on my way. Don't touch anything." She called Devin. He answered on the third ring with the alert voice of a man who had spent 11 years preparing himself to be present for unexpected calls from people in crisis. When he heard her voice, the alertness shifted to something warmer. She told him directly, and without softening it, what had happened. And what the photo contained and what she intended to do about it at a press conference in the morning. She told him she was not asking for permission. She told him that his recovery was not a liability. In her hands, it was a point of pride she intended to announce to every camera in the city. Devin was quiet for a moment. "Simone," he said, "you don't have to do that for me." "I know," she said. "I'm doing it because it's true. And because anyone who thinks your story is a weapon against us has deeply misread our family." Another silence. Then very quietly, "You're going to win this case." "Yes," she said, "I am." She hung up and looked at the knife in her counter. Then she opened her document bag and took out a legal pad and sat down at the kitchen table, the one section they hadn't touched, and she began writing. The fear had burned through. What remained was cold clear and entirely useful. The press conference was at 10 a.m. in the federal building lobby. Reed on her left, two senior DOJ officials she had called in from D.C. on her right. She wore a charcoal suit. Her cheekbone had faded to yellow-green. Her wrists, visible when she set her hands on the podium, still carried the bruising in its last stage. She did not read from notes. "Yesterday evening," she said, looking directly at the 23 assembled reporters and 4 cameras, "my apartment was broken into. Nothing was stolen. My home was deliberately searched and deliberately disordered as a message. A threatening note was left, and I received a blackmail attempt using a photograph of my brother taken years ago, misrepresenting his personal history, for the purpose of coercing me into dropping federal charges against Officer Brett Mallory." The room was very quiet. "I want to address that photograph directly," she said. She looked into the camera she knew Hayes was watching. "My brother Devin has been in recovery for 11 years. He is a counselor who spends every working day helping other people find the same path he found. His recovery is not a vulnerability. It is one of the most courageous things I have ever had the honor of watching up close. To whoever sent that photograph, you found the wrong leverage on the wrong woman." She paused. "Furthermore, this blackmail attempt constitutes additional federal criminal charges that my office will pursue with the full weight of the law. The digital trail from the device to send that photograph is currently being traced. I suggest that anyone involved obtain counsel immediately." She picked up a single sheet. "I also want to share an update in the investigation itself." She let the pause hold its full weight. "My office has obtained and analyzed a physical ledger recovered from a safe deposit box registered in the name of a family member of Officer Mallory. That ledger documents payments received over a period of approximately 4 years. Those payments do not come exclusively from narcotics distribution networks." She looked up from the page. "Some of those payments originate from individuals connected to a human trafficking operation that has been moving women through this city's port district." The room erupted. She raised one hand. The room settled. "Officer Mallory was not a trafficking operator," she said. "He was a protection provider. He accepted money verified at an average of $4,000 per month over 47 months to ensure that certain activity in certain areas of this city went unobserved, unreported, and unprosecuted. He sold the badge given to him by the citizens of this city to protect the vulnerable to men who were exploiting vulnerable women for profit." She set the paper down. "To Mr. Hayes, I want you to understand the RICO implications of what I have just described. Every asset associated with your client, his home, his pension, his vehicle, his retirement accounts, is subject to federal seizure under the Racketeer, Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. I advise you to have that conversation with your client today." She stepped back from the podium. "No further questions. Thank you." By that evening, the podcast had quietly removed the episode featuring Mallory. By the following morning, the union had issued a statement announcing that Hayes would be representing Mallory in a personal capacity, rather than through union funding, citing the evolving nature of the charges. The narrative of a decorated officer being politically persecuted had, with the word trafficking, become impossible to sustain. The machine had fought back. In fighting back, it had given Simone Carter everything she needed and more. Reed came to her office at 3 p.m. on the Thursday of the second week, carrying a tablet and wearing the expression she had learned over 4 months to read accurately. It was the expression of a man who had seen something that angered him and had converted that anger into controlled, directed purpose. Reed was exceptionally good at that conversion. It was among the things she most respected about him. "You need to watch this," he said. He set the tablet on her desk and pressed play. The footage was body camera archive. Date stamp 3 years and 4 months earlier. Location parking structure. See East Lake District. Time 11:21 p.m. Standard city issue quality, not poor, not exceptional. The camera belonged to a perimeter officer stationed on the street below, maintaining the outer edge of a noise complaint response from the adjacent apartment building. He was staying back standard positioning. In the center of his frame, 30 feet ahead, another officer was standing over a young man. The officer was Mallory. She recognized him immediately. The posture, the deliberate occupation of space, the way he stood over someone, the way he stood over everything. The young man was on his knees on the concrete parking structure floor. He was wearing a university sweatshirt with a torn pocket on the front. His hands were raised at shoulder height, open-palmed fingers spread wide, every gesture of absolute non-threat that a human body can produce simultaneously. He was crying, not the theatrical kind, but the specific, undisguised crying of someone who is genuinely terrified and does not understand why this is happening. "Please," he said on the recording, his voice clear through the body cam's microphone. "Please, officer, I wasn't doing anything. I work here at the restaurant. I was taking out the trash. I just came out at the back door." "You fit the description," Mallory said. His voice was calm, uninterested. The voice of a man for whom this was not an unusual Tuesday. "Drug dealer. Got a report." "I'm a student," the young man said. "I'm at UW. I work weekends for my scholarship. Please, can I call someone? Please." "Keep your hands up," Mallory said. He looked at the young man. Then he looked at the ceiling of the parking structure, a measured check of sightlines. He reached toward his belt. Then he pressed the button on his body camera. The camera deactivated. Audio and active video stopped. What neither Mallory nor anyone else at the Precinct 9 narcotics unit had been informed about was the 20-second passive buffer, a quality control mechanism built into that model of body camera that recorded video without audio for 20 seconds after manual shutdown, during which the device appeared fully deactivated to the wearer. It had been implemented by the manufacturer to prevent accidental footage loss. It had never been relevant to an investigation. Until now. In 20 seconds of silent footage, Mallory reached into the front pocket of his uniform trousers, not his belt, not his equipment vest, and removed a small plastic evidence bag. He held it at his side, his body angled to block the sightline of the perimeter officer, 30 feet behind him. He knelt beside the young man's backpack, which was on the floor. The backpack's front pocket was unzipped. Mallory's hand went into it. His hand came out empty. He stood up. He pressed his camera button again. The audio came back mid-sentence, going to need to look inside this bag. "What's this? Well. The young man said something that the recording didn't fully capture, a broken word that sounded like no or please, and then Mallory's boot connected with the left side of his ribcage. Not lightly, with the specific calibrated force of a man who had done this kind of thing before and knew how much was needed. The young man went sideways. The air went out of him audibly. Mallory grabbed him by his collar and hauled him to his feet, and the recording continued for another 4 minutes of processing that Simone did not need to watch. She had seen enough. She set the tablet down. Her hands were not entirely steady, which she noticed, and did not try to conceal from Reed because Reed had been working alongside her for 4 months, and they were past the stage of performing composure for each other. "Marcus Webb," Reed said. "I know," she said. "I saw the name in his file on the drive over on the first morning. Something about the plea terms sat wrong." She looked at the paused frame on the tablet, the young man on his knees, hands up, sweatshirt with the torn pocket. "Where is he now?" "Construction work. Tacoma. He doesn't drive through Eastlake anymore. His mother told our investigator he has panic responses when he sees police vehicles in his rear view." Reed paused. "He's 27 years old." Simone was quiet. She was thinking about the plea deal. She was thinking about the public defender's note, "Client maintains innocence. Evidence appears clean. Advise plea." She was thinking about a 24-year-old who had been told that maintaining his innocence was a luxury that would cost him 2 years of his life he couldn't afford, and who had said okay to something he didn't do because the alternative was worse, and who had then spent 3 years living with the weight of a record that said he was what Mallory had needed him to be. "Get me his number," she said. "I'm calling him myself tonight. Not through an investigator. Me." Marcus Webb answered on the fourth ring with the flat, careful neutrality of a young man who had learned that unexpected calls almost never brought uncomplicated news. Not unfriendly, just cautious in the specific way of someone who had been managing information defensively for 3 years. "Yeah," he said. Marcus Simone said, "My name is Simone Carter. I'm the United States Attorney for the Western District of Washington. I need to speak with you about the arrest in the East Lake parking structure 3 years ago and the charge you pled to. Before I say anything else, I want you to know that I am not calling to ask you for something. I'm calling to tell you something." A silence, not confusion. The particular stillness of a man who is deciding how to exist in the next moment. "Okay," he said. "We have evidence that the narcotics found in your backpack the night of your arrest were planted there before they were discovered." She kept her voice level and direct, without the softened delivery that often communicates pity. "The footage we have recovered conclusively shows Officer Brett Mallory placing that evidence in your bag prior to the recorded discovery. Your conviction is being vacated. The U.S. Attorney's Office is filing the paperwork this week. I wanted you to hear it directly from me today." The silence that followed lasted long enough that she said quietly, "Marcus, are you still there?" "Yeah." His voice had changed entirely. The flatness was gone. 3 years of something weight compression, the specific density of a wrongful conviction carried in silence, was audible in the single syllable as it moved through whatever the opposite of flatness is. "Yeah, I'm here. I know this doesn't return what was taken from you," I told them, his voice barely above a whisper now. "At the precinct, in the public defender's office, in the plea hearing, I told everyone what happened. I told them I didn't have anything in my bag. I told them I was taking out restaurant trash." He stopped. She could hear his breathing. "Nobody said nobody even." He stopped again. "Nobody believed me." "I know," she said. "I'm sorry that happened, and I'm sorry it took this long." "He kicked me," Marcus said. "I had a bruised rib for 3 weeks, and I didn't tell anyone because I thought—" He stopped. "I thought if I made any more noise, they'd add something else. So I just stayed quiet and pled out to something I didn't do, because my defender said the evidence was too solid to fight." His voice had a quality in it now that was close to bewilderment, the specific bewilderment of someone who had accepted a story about themselves that was wrong and had been living inside it for 3 years and was only now being told it wasn't true. "I stopped trying to go back to school. I couldn't. The record, every application, every employer. It's just there. It follows you everywhere." "I spoke with the University of Washington this afternoon," Simone said. "Their scholarship office is being notified of your exoneration. Your scholarship is being reinstated effective immediately. You can re-enroll for the fall semester." What followed was not the silence of someone receiving news. It was the silence of someone for whom the news was too large to be processed at the speed it was delivered, and who was trying to find the ground under it. "Marcus," she said, "I keep thinking—" He started and stopped. "I keep thinking about who I was going to be. Before that night, I was 2 semesters from finishing. I had an internship lined up downtown at a firm. I had—" His voice broke cleanly, the way something breaks when it has been held together too long. "I had plans. I had so many plans." Simone was quiet for a moment. "You still do," she said. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was very quiet and very stripped of everything except what it actually was. "Thank you for believing me. Thank you for being right," she said. She set the phone down on her desk and looked out the rain-streaked window at the Seattle skyline. The same rain. The same patient, indifferent city. She let herself be still for 30 seconds, not as indulgence, but as maintenance, the deliberate practice of someone who ran on combustion and knew the cost of not stopping. Then she called Devin. He answered immediately. She told him briefly about Marcus Webb, not the details of the case, just the fact of him. The fact that he had told the truth and not been believed, and that she had believed him in a parking lot file on a Tuesday morning before any of this had started. Devin listened. When she finished, he said, "That's why you do this. Yes, she said. You're going to win this case, he said. You were always going to win it. She thanked him and hung up. She allowed herself 5 more seconds at the window. Then she turned back to the files. The trial of United States versus Brett Mallory opened on a Monday in October with a line at the courthouse door that the building's security staff described as the longest they had seen for a non-celebrity criminal proceeding in over a decade. The gallery held 140 people. By 8:45 a.m., every seat was filled. Community advocates who had filed the original complaints that started Simone's investigation. Officers from other precincts attending in a complex mixture of professional solidarity, institutional anxiety, and something that might generously be called accountability. National press alongside the local papers. Several of Precinct 9's suspended officers sitting in the back rows with the specific blankness of people who had exhausted their postures. Marcus Webb sat on the right side of the gallery, near the front, in a new shirt, looking at nothing in particular with the focused stillness of someone who had rehearsed being in this room until the rehearsal, and the reality had become indistinguishable. His mother sat beside him, with her hands folded in her lap and her jaw set. At the defense table, Brett Mallory sat in a dark blue suit that was a size too large. He had lost 23 pounds since his arrest. The weight had left his face first. The jowls reduced the broken capillary flush of his complexion, faded to something pale and unmapped. He looked like a reduced version of the man who had filled the captain's office doorway, the same dimensions, but something essential removed. His hands on the table were still. Stillness on those hands looked wrong, like machinery that had been powered down but not cleared. Conrad Hayes sat beside him. His legal pad was covered with notes. His expression was the professional neutrality of a man who had reviewed the discovery file and was now in the business of managing outcomes rather than contesting facts. Simone was not in the lead prosecutor's chair. She had made a deliberate choice to allow her deputy James Okafor, a sharp and thorough attorney who had been with the Western District for 8 years, to handle the daily conduct of the trial. Simone sat 4 rows back in the gallery, in civilian clothes, with a legal pad and a pen. She wanted Mallory to be able to see her whenever he looked at the gallery. She wanted to be the constant fact of the room, the quiet reminder that she was still present, still building, still ahead of wherever he thought he was. Mallory looked at her on the first morning and did not look again for 2 days. She took this as confirmation. The prosecution's case was constructed the way Simone built every case methodically, with the structure of something that could not be selectively disbelieved. You had to accept all of it or none of it. And accepting none of it required ignoring the physical evidence, the digital evidence, the financial records. 3 cooperating witnesses and a voicemail in the defendant's own voice. Officer Dylan Webb took the stand first. He was 26 years old, pale precise, and unable to look at Mallory. He had cooperated with Reed's team within the hour of Mallory's arrest, not from bravery, he would later say, but from the simple exhaustion of 2 years of knowing something wrong was happening and saying nothing, which had turned out to be heavier than he had anticipated. "Did you witness Officer Mallory plant evidence?" Okafor asked. "Yes," Webb said. "Multiple times." "How many times, approximately?" Webb was quiet. "I lost count," he said. "That's the honest answer. I lost count, and I told myself it wasn't my problem because he was my senior officer. And because the precinct ran on the way things ran, and I was wrong. I've been wrong for 2 years, and I knew it both times." The jury looked at him. Some of them looked at Mallory. Mallory looked at the table. "Why didn't you report it?" Webb's hands were flat on the witness stand railing. "He told me," Webb said, "that if I ever said anything to anyone, I would end up dead in an alley, and it would be logged as a drug deal gone wrong. He said he had friends everywhere." He said he paused, and the pause had the quality of someone deciding to repeat something exactly. He said, "Nobody comes for me. In this city, nobody has ever come for me." The jury sat with that for a moment. Then Marcus Webb walked to the stand. He walked with a slight leftward tilt that was barely perceptible, unless you were looking for it, the permanent physical remainder of the night, a steel-toed boot connected with his left rib cage in a Eastlake parking structure. He sat down. He looked at the jury with the direct, unhurried gaze of a man who had nothing to perform and nothing to protect and nothing to ask for except to be heard. He told his story simply, without the strategic emotional calibration that testimony sometimes acquires through over-rehearsal. He told it the way it had happened in the order it had happened, and the plainness of it made the facts land harder than drama would have. When he described what Mallory's boot felt like, he said, "I couldn't breathe for about 30 seconds. I thought something was broken." He paused. Something was broken, but not the rib. The rib healed in 3 weeks. In the jury box, 2 jurors looked away from Mallory. One juror looked directly at him and did not look away for a long time. The final piece of evidence came on the last morning before closing arguments. Okafor had built to it with the deliberate patience of someone who understood that the most important evidence in a trial is most effective when the jury already knows it's coming, when they have been waiting for it, when its arrival feels like the resolution of something that has been building for 11 days. "Your Honor," Okafor said the prosecution would like to play Government Exhibit 41. A voicemail recovered from the defendant's personal cellular device left for his wife at 6:14 a.m. on the morning of his arrest, approximately 26 minutes before the events at Precinct 9. The judge granted permission. The courtroom adjusted. The gallery went still. Every journalist in the room had their pen ready. The speakers carried Mallory's voice into every corner of the room with a clarity that felt almost surgical. The casual, private, completely unguarded voice of a man on a Tuesday morning who had been operating without consequences for so long that he no longer felt their absence as anything worth noting. "Hey babe, going to be late tonight. I need to make rounds on 5th Street, collect the month end from the guys. We need the extra cash. Contractor wants a deposit on the remodel, and I told him we'd have it by Friday. Don't worry about Dylan. The captain doesn't see anything I don't want him to see. Never has." A brief pause, and then with the complete, uncomplicated confidence of a man stating a fact about the whether I run this place. "I always have. I am the law here." The silence that followed was not the polite silence of a courtroom waiting for the next procedural step. It was the silence of 140 people having received something they could not return. In the jury box, the woman who had been taking meticulous notes throughout the trial set down her pen. She did not pick it up for the remainder of the session. The retired man in the second row, gray-bearded the juror who had asked the most questions during voir dire about the burden of proof and the standard for reasonable doubt, looked at Brett Mallory for a long considering moment, and then looked at the floor and did not raise his eyes again. The journalism student from the Seattle Times in the second gallery row stopped typing mid-sentence and looked at her screen as if the sentence she had been writing was no longer the right sentence. Conrad Hayes sat completely still. His pen was on the table. His hands were on his knees. He was looking at the exhibit number on the evidence display, and he was not moving. Mallory sat with his eyes straight ahead and his jaw locked, and his face performing the composure of a man who has understood somewhere deeper than the place where composure lives that he has just heard the last wall come down. Marcus Webb, in the third gallery row, released a breath so slow and so controlled that it was clear he had been holding some version of it for 3 years. James Okafor let the silence run. 4 full seconds an eternity in a federal courtroom. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. No further questions. "Your Honor," he said. He picked up his files and walked back to the prosecution table. On the 4th day, Mallory insisted on testifying. Hayes had advised against it, in language that left no ambiguity about his professional opinion. Mallory had overridden him with the particular certainty of a man who believed he could still reframe the narrative if he was given an unfiltered platform, which was the same belief that had produced the podcast and the press conference whisper campaign and every other decision he had made since the morning of his arrest that had in aggregate added 6 exhibits to the prosecution's file. Simone walked from the gallery to the prosecution table and stood briefly behind Okafor as he stepped aside. The courtroom understood that something was changing. She carried a legal pad and a single sheet of paper, and she walked to the witness stand with the unhurried pace she used in closing arguments. The pace of someone who had already won and was simply performing the final necessary steps. She looked at Mallory. "Mr. Mallory," she said in a voice that was almost conversational. "Do you remember the morning we met?" I do, he said. His voice was controlled. He had prepared for this. He would not break on the stand. You ordered me to place my hands on my head and turn toward the wall. She said not as an accusation, but as a recitation of fact. You applied handcuffs at a pressure that resulted in bruising, documented and photographed at my physician's office the following morning. You walked me through your precinct bullpen and announced to your colleagues that you had caught a quote live one and described my claimed title as a punchline. She paused. You told me in the elevator corridor before the officers from the building arrived that nobody was coming for me. That in that building, you were the law. I believed you were a threat, Mallory said. You believed I was a threat, Simone said, because I was a black woman in a hoodie standing in a room you associated with authority. She let the statement breathe for 1 second. Mr. Mallory, if I had been a white woman in a business suit standing in that same office looking at that same shelf with no identification visible, would you have walked me to the elevator in handcuffs? Hayes was on his feet. Objection. Calls for speculation. Sustained, the judge said. The jury had already heard the question. Every person in the room had heard it, and the answer lived in the air of the courtroom in a way that no ruling could remove. Simone changed direction without breaking stride. You described yourself on a recorded podcast as a traditional officer who upholds the code, she said. You said that in your years of service the law was the law, and you enforced it. Is that an accurate summary of your professional philosophy? I believe in upholding the law, yes, Mallory said. The ledger entered into evidence. As Exhibit 14, Simone said, turning slightly to reference the exhibit display documents, payments received by you over a period of 47 months. The payments total $342,000. They originate in part from individuals connected to the movement of women through this city's port district for commercial exploitation. She turned back to him. The ledger is in your handwriting. It was found in a safe deposit box, registered in your mother's maiden name. She looked at him with an expression that was not contempt and was not satisfaction, but was simply the expression of someone who has arrived at the destination of a long journey and is acknowledging it. As a traditional officer who upholds the code, what part of the code specifically covers accepting payments from men who sell women? Hayes, objection. Mallory. I didn't know what they were doing. The courtroom held its breath. With the money, he added too quickly, in the way of a man who hears himself going somewhere he didn't intend and tries to redirect mid-sentence and fails. I took the envelopes. I didn't ask what they were doing with it. I didn't ask where the money came from. I just took the envelopes. The courtroom erupted. Hayes dropped his pen. It hit the floor, and the sound of it was very clear. Mallory heard himself a full second after he had said it. His mouth opened. No words came out. His eyes moved to Hayes, who was sitting with his head in one hand and was not looking at him, and then to the jury, who were looking at him with an expression that had moved past judgment into something simpler and more complete. Simone was already turning away. No further questions, Your Honor, she said. She walked back to this gallery with the unhurried, measured steps of someone who was already thinking about the next case, and she sat down and opened her legal pad, and she did not look at Mallory again for the remainder of the proceedings, and in that deliberate not looking was the most precise statement of where he stood. He was already a closed file. The jury returned in 3 hours and 51 minutes. Mallory stood when the foreperson stood. He gripped the defense table with both hands. Hayes was making notes with the focused efficiency of a man already in the next phase of his work, the appeal architecture, the procedural motions, the machinery that professional defenders maintain between the verdict and the sentence. On the count of conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, the foreperson read, "We find the defendant guilty." Mallory's grip tightened. On the count of deprivation of rights under color of law, guilty. His right hand began to shake. On the count of falsification of official law enforcement records, guilty. Patricia Mallory in the gallery, 3 rows behind the defense table, stood up during the 4th count. She stood without drama, without a sound, with the complete composure of a woman who had made a decision before she came today and was now executing it. She picked up her coat and her bag. She walked to the end of her row. She moved to the aisle. She walked out of the courtroom without looking at her husband. Mallory watched her go. He turned back to the table. His face had the quality of a landscape. After something structural has been removed from it, the familiar topography still present, but the thing that had given it its character, gone. His hands on the table had stopped shaking and gone completely still, the stillness of someone who has stopped trying to control something. By the 8th count, conspiracy charges extending back 14 years, he was no longer holding the table for composure. He was holding it because without it, he would not be standing. The jury is dismissed with the court's gratitude, Judge Owens said. Bail is revoked effective immediately, pending sentencing. Marshals. 2 federal marshals moved from the side door with the purposeful efficiency of people for whom this was the expected conclusion. They were beside Mallory before Hayes had finished closing his notebook. "I have names," Mallory said suddenly to the room with the urgent energy of a man who has just identified the last currency he might have. "People at City Hall, in the county DA's office, people who were, I can give you names. I know things that Mr. Mallory." Simone said. She did not stand up. She looked at him from her gallery seat with the level regard of someone who had already organized the next phase of the investigation and was reviewing it on the legal pad in front of her. "It's too late for that," she said. "You had 22 years of mornings where you could have been something different. What you chose instead is documented and in evidence and has been heard and decided by 12 people. The marshals are waiting." Mallory looked at her. For a moment, in the specific quality of that look, she could see the full dimension of what he had been, not the monster of an indictment, but the man who had been 22 years old once, who had taken an oath, who had had the same choice every other officer had every morning about who to be inside the uniform. She saw it, and she did not soften, and she did not look away. The marshals walked him out. 1 week later, the same courtroom, the same gray sky, a different composition in the gallery. More community members this time. More of the ordinary people whose lives the investigation had touched in ways that did not make the news coverage. Marcus Webb in the 3rd row with his mother, who was wearing her good dress and sitting with her hands folded with the precise stillness of someone who has been waiting for a long time for something to be said in a room like this. Mallory arrived in an orange jumpsuit and wrist shackles chained to a waist belt. He had lost more weight. The jumpsuit was a size too large, and the excess fabric made him look depleted in a way the too large suit at trial hadn't quite achieved. He could not raise his hands above his sternum. He could not gesture. He could not use his body, the instrument of 22 years of authority, the way he had always used it. He was 52 years old, and he looked like a smaller version of himself had been left in his place. Judge Patricia Owens settled at the bench. She was 61, with 20 years on the federal bench, and a reputation for opinions that were, in Simone's estimation, some of the clearest moral reasoning produced by any court in the Pacific Northwest. She did not give theatrical sentencing speeches. She said what needed to be said without embellishment in a way that stayed with people. She looked at Mallory over her reading glasses. "Brett Mallory, you have requested leniency on the basis of 22 years of service," she began. Her voice was even unhurried, the voice of someone who had considered every word before arriving. "The court has reviewed that request and denies it. 22 years of service does not mitigate 22 years of abuse. It compounds them. Each year in which you operated without consequence is not a mitigating circumstance. It is an additional year of harm to the people of this city who trusted you." Mallory looked at the floor. "You were given a badge," Judge Owens continued. "You were given authority over your fellow citizens, the authority to protect the vulnerable, to enforce the law fairly, to be the most direct and personal expression of the public trust. That authority did not belong to you. It was lent to you in the expectation that you would use it as it was intended. Instead, you converted it. You took a public trust and made it a private instrument." She looked at Marcus Webb in the 3rd row. She said his name into the record. Marcus Webb was 24 years old. He was a student. He was working a weekend shift to maintain his scholarship. You looked at him in a parking structure and decided what he was before he finished his sentence, and then you manufactured the evidence to confirm what you had already decided. He lost 2 years of his life, his degree, his scholarship, and 3 additional years living under the weight of a record that your hands put there. He did nothing. You knew he did nothing. You did it anyway. She set down the document she had been consulting. Furthermore, this court has reviewed your documented connection to the trafficking operation and finds, based on the financial record and the testimony presented, that your knowing acceptance of payments over 47 months with deliberate incuriosity about their source enabled the exploitation of women in this city. They will not be named in conjunction with you. They deserve better than that association. She picked up her pen. You told a national audience during your bail period that you were a traditional officer who followed the code. This court observes that the code of law enforcement, properly understood, exists for one purpose: the protection of the vulnerable. The most vulnerable people in this city, young men targeted for arrest quotas, women trafficked through a port district while you collected your monthly envelope, were the people the code was written to protect. They were the people you chose to harm or abandon. She looked at him directly, with the level complete regard of someone delivering a conclusion that has been earned through full consideration. You were not a traditional officer. You were a man with a badge and a decision made every single morning for 22 years to use that badge for yourself. She raised her gavel. Brett Allen Mallory, I sentence you to 27 years in federal custody with no eligibility for parole until 80% of the sentence has been served. Your municipal pension is seized in full. Your residential property and all liquid assets are ordered liquidated for victim restitution. You are permanently barred from employment in any capacity in any law enforcement agency in the United States of America. She looked at him one final time, not with contempt, with the specific sober finality of someone closing a door that will not open again. You spent 22 years deciding who belonged and who didn't, she said. The jury has decided where you belong. Use the time, Mr. Mallory, all 27 years of it, to understand the difference between power and authority. Because you had the first one, you never came close to the second. The gavel came down. In the third row, Marcus Webb's mother closed her eyes. She kept them closed for a long moment. Her hands folded in her lap, did not move. When she opened her eyes, she looked at her son. He was looking straight ahead at the bench, at the space where the judge had been, and his jaw was set, and his eyes were bright, and something in his posture, something in the particular straightness of his spine had changed. Simone watched this from the front row. She noted it. She filed it in the place where she kept the things that reminded her why she did this work. The marshals came for Mallory. He did not resist. He was walked out of the courtroom with the careful pace of a man who has run out of room in every direction, and the door swung shut behind him, and he was gone. Simone was already closing her folder. The transport bus to Whitmore Federal Penitentiary in Central California took 11 hours, and Mallory spent every one of them looking out a window covered in wire mesh that divided the passing landscape into small diamond fragments. Scrubland, highway, the particular geography that belongs to no specific place. He thought about the office, not the precinct, generally the specific configuration of Captain Dillon's office. The framed commendations at their precise angles. The desk he had pushed a woman's face against with the casual authority of a man who had never imagined the sentence until today. He kept turning the room over, looking for the moment when a different version of him could have made a different choice. He could find the moment. What he could not find in any honest accounting of himself was the version that would have chosen differently. The bus passed through Whitmore's gates at 6:15 p.m. The intake corrections officer was 30, efficient, and completely indifferent in the specific way of someone who had processed 1,000 men through this room and would process 1,000 more, and for whom each one was a form to complete rather than a story to engage with. He directed Mallory through the sequence without ceremony. Civilian clothes exchanged for an orange uniform that smelled of industrial detergent and someone else's history. Photograph, fingerprints, number. Inmate 58-9144. Mallory attempted the thing he had always done in new environments. He tried to establish professional rapport, the brief collegial acknowledgement between people in the same line of work, the unspoken currency of institutional belonging. I was on the job for 22 years, he said, in the voice he used when he wanted to be recognized as reasonable. Seattle, PD. I know you have your protocols, but we're both in this system, right? Broadly speaking, The officer looked at him, not with hostility, not with contempt, with the flat, absolute indifference of a man looking at a number on a form. "You're not on the job anymore," the officer said. "You're inmate 58-9144. D Block Unit 7. Chow is at 0600 and 1730. Yard access Tuesday and Thursday. Move forward." Mallory moved forward. His cellmate was a man named Garrett Lean, where Mallory had been heavy precise, where Mallory had been imposing with tattoos from collar to knuckles that Mallory recognized from 22 years of processing people as the iconography of a specific and long-standing prison network. Garrett looked up from a worn paperback when Mallory came in and assessed him in approximately 2 seconds with the thoroughness of a comprehensive audit. "Derek Mallory," Garrett said. "Not a question. A notation." "I'm just doing my time," Mallory said. He set his mattress roll on the upper bunk. "No trouble." Garrett looked at him for one more moment. "You planted evidence on kids," he said. "You took money from men who move women." He turned a page. "We have a code in here. We don't like cops. But what we really genuinely can't tolerate is cops who have no honor." He looked at the page. "Word travels fast, Mallory. Think carefully about that." Mallory climbed to his upper bunk and lay looking at the ceiling, and thought about what it had felt like to walk into a room and have the room rearrange itself around his presence. He thought about what it felt like to walk into a room now. 3 weeks in on a Thursday afternoon, Mallory walked the perimeter fence and tried to be invisible. He had, in 22 years of police work, developed a reliable gift for reading rooms, for entering a space, and within 90 seconds, having an accurate map of the power dynamics, the alliances, the points of tension. He was using that skill now for a purpose entirely different from any he had previously applied it to. He was using it for survival. He was near the eastern fence, moving at a pace calculated to look purposeful, without being hurried, when 3 men peeled away from a group near the weight equipment and began moving on an intersecting course. The movement was not rushed. It had the patient-considered geometry of people who had decided where this was going and were not in any hurry to get there. He recognized one of them. The recognition came slowly, the way recognizing someone always comes slowly, when you are in a place you did not expect to see them. The man was younger looking than Mallory remembered, which was simply the fact of someone who had done his time without the accumulation of outside pressure. His name was Andre Morrison. He had been 20 years old, when Mallory arrested him. A quota arrest, one of a category of arrests Mallory had been making for years. The kind where the charge would not survive a vigorous legal defense, but the public defender's caseload was staggering, and the plea deal was offered at 48 hours, and the defendant had no particular reason to believe the system would weigh his testimony against an officer's. Morrison had been 2 months from finishing a community college business program. Officer Mallory Morrison said. He stopped 6 feet away. He was not smiling. His expression was not rage. It was something more considered and more specific. The expression of a man who had been waiting for a particular reckoning for a long time and had arrived at it and found it to be in some complicated way exactly what he had imagined, and nothing like it simultaneously. Morrison Mallory said, "I remember you. You told the judge I was a menace to my community," Morrison said. His voice was even. "You testified that you had observed me in multiple transactions and that the evidence found in my car was consistent with intent to distribute. I was carrying a textbook and a bag of food. I had never been arrested in my life." My mother cried through the hearing. Mallory looked at the other 2 men. He looked at the fence behind him. He looked at the yard, the corrections officers in their towers, the calculation of distances. "I know things went wrong," Mallory started. "Don't," Morrison said. "One word. It carried 14 months and 6 years, and every version of justice that had processed Morrison through a system that had Mallory's hands in it. Just don't say anything. I didn't come over here for an explanation." What happened in the next 40 seconds was something Mallory would not describe in the letters he eventually wrote from the infirmary, which he wrote in the careful language of a man who had learned very recently what consequences felt like when they were not abstract. He spent 12 days in the infirmary, 3 broken ribs, a fractured orbital socket, dental work that would take months to complete. Tas says, When he was returned to D Block, the mountain had eroded. He was thin in the way that injury and sleeplessness and sustained fear make a person thin from the inside out. He filed grievances. He wrote letters to the warden requesting a housing transfer. He submitted formal requests for protective custody assignment. Each request moved through the institutional system with the responsiveness and urgency that his own complaints had moved through the complaint log at Precinct 9, processed, acknowledged, queued, marked, administratively addressed. He was experiencing with full texture the machine he had spent 22 years operating. 18 months into his sentence, a visitor request was approved. Patricia had sent the divorce papers through her attorney with a 5-sentence cover note that contained no profanity and no expressed emotion, and was in its complete absence of drama, the most devastating document he had received in the entire proceeding. She had taken their son, 15, enrolled him in a new school 300 miles north, and by all accounts, available to Mallory through the occasional secondhand fragment, was genuinely doing better. Rachel was 26. She worked at a tech company in Bellevue. She had her mother's composure and a directness that Mallory had always attributed to himself, until he understood too late that it had not come from him, it had developed in spite of him. She sat down across the reinforced glass on a Tuesday afternoon. She picked up the phone. He picked up his. She looked at him for a long moment before she said anything. She looked at him with the specific weary steadiness of someone who had finished grieving and was now simply noting what remained. "Dad," she said. "Rachel." The word came out rough, unused. He had not spoken her name out loud in 18 months. "I didn't think you'd come. I wasn't sure I would," she said. "I came because I need to say some things and be done saying them. Not for your sake. For mine." "Okay," he said. "Mom is remarried," she said. "His name is David. He's a high school history teacher. He coaches junior varsity soccer. He shows up for things dinner school events, Caleb's games. He's present in the specific way that you never were." She said it without cruelty. As a fact of the record, she's happy. Caleb is stable. They're going to be okay. She paused. "They were not okay when you were there. You didn't see it because you were never really looking." Mallory's hand moved toward the glass. "I changed my last name," Rachel said. He stopped. "I'm Rachel Nolan now. Mom's maiden name." She held his gaze without flinching. "I made the change 8 months ago. I thought about telling you, and I kept deciding not to. I realized recently that not telling you was its own cruelty, and I'm trying not to be that person." "Rachel, I'm getting married in the spring," she said. "His name is James. He's a good person. Genuinely good, not good-looking on paper good." She paused. "My stepfather David is walking me down the aisle." He made a sound, involuntary from somewhere below, the place where words lived. "I know that hurts," she said. Not softly, not with pity. With the measured honesty of someone delivering the truth, because the truth is the only thing worth delivering. "But you weren't there, Dad. You were the precinct. You were the badge and the power. And this thing you were building on other people's suffering. And the rest of us were just the furniture in the house that thing lived in." She looked down at the phone in her hand, then back at him. Her eyes were bright, but her jaw was steady. "I wanted you to know I'm going to be more than okay. I wanted you to hear it from me." She stood up. "And I wanted you to know that the people you hurt, Marcus Webb, and all the others, they're going to be more than okay, too. Because the woman you put in handcuffs made sure of it." She looked at him one last time. "Goodbye, Derek." She hung up. She walked to the door with the straight, unhurried posture of someone who had made this decision before she arrived and was not reconsidering it. The door opened. The door closed. The soundproofed glass absorbed the sound of his voice completely. The guard came over in 30 seconds. "Visiting time is over. Back to your block." Mallory was walked back to D Block. He sat on his bunk and looked at the small rectangle of California sky visible through the narrow window gray marine layer, the precise color of the Seattle sky on the morning this had all started, and he thought about 3 seconds. The 3 seconds in which he had looked at a woman in a green hoodie and decided what she was. 27 years was a long time to think about 3 seconds. Simone Carter did not stop with Mallory. The Precinct 9 investigation became the foundation for the Pacific Northwest Integrity Initiative, a federal oversight framework establishing independent civilian review boards with full subpoena power, mandatory body camera preservation protocols, and unannounced federal audits of arrest documentation. It was adopted by 14 precincts across 3 states within 22 months. Captain Frank Dillon was not criminally charged. Negligence is not a federal crime, though it carries consequences of its own kind, and was removed from command, replaced by a reformer promoted from within the department's Internal Affairs Division. 4 other officers implicated in the narcotics ring were indicted within 6 months. Officer Dylan Webb cooperated fully with federal investigators. He was not prosecuted. He was reassigned to community liaison work under the new command and, by most accounts, from the Rainier Valley. Became a police officer who actually showed up for people. Marcus Webb did not answer his phone when the University of Washington Scholarship Office called to tell him his enrollment was being reinstated. He listened to the voicemail alone in his car in a parking lot in Tacoma. He played it 3 times. Then he drove to his mother's house in the middle of her cooking dinner and stood in her kitchen and told her what Simone Carter had done, and she turned off the stove and held him for a long time without either of them needing to say anything at all. He graduated 2 years behind the classmates he had started with and 2 years ahead of every version of himself that had been meant to end in an Eastlake parking structure. He is in his 2nd year of law school at the University of Washington. He has not yet announced what kind of law he intends to practice, but everyone who knows him says the answer is obvious and that he will be very, very good at it. Simone Carter was confirmed to the United States Court of Appeals for the 9th Circuit 2 years after the Mallory case closed. On her first morning on the bench, she arrived 25 minutes early, which her clerks would later describe as characteristic. She wore her judicial robe. Her natural hair was pinned simply. Her credentials were unchallenged at the door. She sat down, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at her courtroom with the same level, clear, accountable gaze she had carried into every room that had ever questioned her right to be there. The first case on her docket was a wrongful imprisonment appeal. She had read the file the night before, cross-referenced against relevant precedent, and she already knew how she was going to rule. She opened the session with a single sentence that her clerks would later say became something of an unofficial text in the building. In this court, everyone who walks through that door is who they say they are until the evidence says otherwise. Then she called the first case. She got to work. She did not put her hood up. She let the light hit her face. It felt clean. Thank you for watching. If this story stayed with you, please subscribe to our channel. We bring you new stories every week. And tell us in the comments, Mallory said he was just following instinct. Do you think he knew exactly what he was doing, or did he genuinely not see it? Let us know. We read every single one.